In 2016, a couple was walking up this dirt path on this wooded hillside when they came up to this huge barbed wire fence. And all over this fence were signs saying no trespassing and warning people that what was on the other side of this fence was very dangerous. But the couple ignored these signs and slipped through a break in the fence to the other side and just kept on walking. Minutes later, that couple would come face to face with a monster. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to do the like button's dishes, but be sure to leave all of the cups and bowls right side up inside of their dishwasher. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. While she was in high school in Dayton, Ohio, Raquel Bain became known as a bit of a thrill seeker, primarily because she would do something called car surfing, which is exactly what it sounds like. She would climb onto the exterior of cars and hold on to the roof while somebody else drove it around. In addition to seeking out these physical thrills, Raquel was also drawn to psychological ones, like going to places that were supposedly haunted and seeing if she could spook herself. Following high school, Raquel kind of calmed down and became less of the wild teenager she was known for being, and instead she really focused on building a life and a career for herself. And so she would go to college and she would earn her degree in surgical technologies, and then by 2009 she was employed full-time as a surgical assistant in Dayton. Also around that time, she had her first child, a son, who she adored. But despite creating this life full of stereotypically adult, mature things like having a career and starting a family, deep down, Raquel was still very much the thrill-seeking wild teenager she was back in high school. But as an adult, she just never had time to go seek out those thrills. So with that in mind, fast forward to April of 2016. By this point, Raquel is 26 years old, and that month, a very rare weekend popped up where Raquel did not have to work and she didn't have any childcare responsibilities. And so, wanting to take advantage of this free time, Raquel asked her boyfriend, 41-year-old David Nee, if he would join her on a road trip that weekend to Louisville, Kentucky, where Raquel wanted to check out the infamously scary Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Back in the 1900s, Waverly Hills was a place where tuberculosis patients were sent. Tuberculosis, or TB for short, is an infection of the lungs and it can be deadly. Today, there's a cure for it, but back in the early 1900s, there wasn't. And so most of the people who went to Waverly Hills died there, and usually very slowly and painfully and in total isolation from their families, because in virtue of being sent to Waverly Hills, they were effectively being quarantined to stop the spread of the disease. Waverly Hills would eventually shut down permanently in 1961 because by that point the cure had been found, and after it shut down, the building basically just sat there. Nobody else came in and turned it into anything else. And so this building is basically abandoned, and lots of people began sneaking in to see what it was like in there, and a shocking number of these trespassers reported seeing ghosts inside. Today, the sanatorium is still very much in the same condition it was left in, but the Waverly Hills Historical Society has stepped in and made it very hard for people to sneak into the building. However, knowing people do want to go in and look around, the Historical Society has begun offering guided tours of the sanatorium, and these tours are given exclusively at night to increase the spooky effect. And so David, who had only been dating Raquel for a month when she asked him to come with her to the sanatorium, he was not really that keen on doing this. It did not really appeal to him to go walking around this totally terrifying place, but he could tell it was important to Raquel. She was really excited about it, and so he agreed to go. A few days later, on the late afternoon of April 23rd, the new couple left Raquel's place, they climbed into the car, and they began driving south. 3 hours later, they arrived in Louisville and they stopped to get dinner. And then after they were done eating, they looked at the time and realized it was only about 6:45 p.m. and the tour they had scheduled at the sanatorium was not until 10 p.m. So they had a few hours to kill. And before David could suggest anything, Raquel already had the perfect idea of how they should kill this time. She told David that earlier that day, she had learned about a spot just outside of Louisville that might actually be more terrifying than the sanatorium they had come all this way to see. And so Raquel wanted to spend these few hours checking out this new spooky spot. This spooky spot was a rickety old, narrow, abandoned-looking bridge called the Pope Lick Trestle. It's located just east of downtown Louisville in this heavily wooded area. The bridge is about 800 feet long, and at its highest point, right in the middle of the bridge, it's about 90 to 100 feet off the ground. And this bridge connects the tops of two of the bigger rolling hills in the area. But the bridge's physical appearance has nothing to do with why it's considered so spooky. The reason the Pope Lick Trestle has become a central part of Kentucky folklore is because locals say there is a monster called the Pope Lick Monster that lives underneath the bridge. It's half goat, half man, and when anyone is near this bridge at night, this monster is supposed to come out from underneath this bridge, and then what happens next is very ambiguous. It kind of depends on who you're talking to, but generally speaking, once the Pope Lick Monster has emerged and it sees you, you're dead. Now, how you die ranges from the monster leaping out and attacking you with an axe to the monster using some sort of mind control to lure you up onto the bridge where you leap off. David, after hearing this suggestion, was again not really that keen to go do this really terrifying sounding thing, but seeing the excitement in his girlfriend's face, he agreed to go. And so the two left the restaurant, they climbed back in the car, and they drove for about 15 or 20 minutes to the Pope Lick Trestle Bridge. The bridge actually passed over a relatively main road, and so the couple parked just off the side of this main road, and then once they were outside, they began looking for a pathway up this hillside to get up to the bridge. And very quickly, they found a well-worn dirt path that snaked up the side of this wooded hillside that looked very much like it would bring them up to the bridge. So with Raquel in front and David behind her, they began walking up this dirt path. And as they're walking, they start to see signs that clearly say, "No trespassing." But they ignore them because they're looking at this path thinking, okay, lots of people clearly come up here, so we've got to be okay. And so they keep on walking up this path and they're getting closer and closer to the top of this hill where they think it's going to connect with this bridge. And right as they're getting close, they see there's this huge chain link fence, this 8-foot tall chain link fence with barbed wire across the top that extends in either direction out of view. And so the couple walks up to this fence and there are more signs that say no trespassing, private property, and there are additional warning signs saying that what is on the other side of this fence is also just plain dangerous, so turn around and leave. Every fall, when the leaves start to turn colors and the weather starts to get cool, people flock in droves to their nearest coffee shop to order a pumpkin spice latte. And every year when I see this phenomenon occur, I think to myself, how hasn't anyone started a seasonal eel teeth and milk sandwich restaurant? It's such an obvious compliment to the pumpkin spice latte. Well, this year I decided enough was enough. I was going to fill this massive hole in the marketplace and become the eel teeth and milk sandwich king. However, I pretty much immediately ran into a very big issue. The 5 mini poodles that I hired to help me grow and run this restaurant franchise instantly began to struggle with some basic tasks that I had outlined in the job description, like being able to hold things with your thumbs and speaking a human language. And so just a couple of days ago, as I'm sitting in my office trying for the 100th time to teach these mini poodles how to speak English and how to use their thumbs, my pet frog, Seagull Lung, came flying in and slapped me right in the coccyx and said, "Papa, tu avoir."
Papa, tu dois avoir ZipRecruiter.
Papa, tu devoir ZipRecruiter, which of course in French means, Dad, we need to use ZipRecruiter. And boy was old Lungy right. ZipRecruiter, which is the #1 rated hiring site according to G2 satisfaction ratings as of January 1st, 2022, uses its powerful technology to find and match the right candidates with your job. And then you can easily go through all of these recommended candidates and invite only your top choices to apply for your job, meaning you won't have to hire as many unqualified mini poodles. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at my exclusive web address, ziprecruiter.com/mrballen. Again, that's ziprecruiter.com/mrballen, or you can click the link in the description below. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. As Raquel and David are staring at all these signs and this fence, they see, not far from the path, somebody had clearly bent 2 of the fence posts and created a narrow gap in the fence that you could slip through. And so from David and Raquel's perspective, that looked like the way other trespassers must have found their way up to the bridge, and so it must be safe. And so once again, the couple disregarded all the warnings. They made their way over to this gap in the fence, they both slipped through, and they kept on walking up the hill. Just a couple of minutes later, they reached this clearing, which was at the top of this hill. And once they were in this clearing, they were able to turn and they could actually see the bridge. It was only a couple hundred feet away from them. And it was totally intimidating. By this point, it's totally dark out. And from their perspective, all they see is this very narrow bridge that they know is 100 feet off the ground at certain points. And they can see there's no guardrails on either side of this bridge. It would have almost looked like a tightrope kind of extending off into the darkness. But even if the couple was really intimidated by the sight of this bridge and with all these warning signs before it, they were able to put their fear aside and just keep on going. And so with David now in the lead and Raquel behind him, they walked the couple of hundred feet over to the start of this narrow bridge. And when they got there, without actually stepping onto the bridge, David came to a stop. He turned around to face Raquel and he gestured for her to come stand next to him so they could take a selfie with the bridge in the background. Because David at this point is thinking, we're not going to go on this bridge. We're just going to look at this bridge, take some pictures, and then we'll go. But Raquel, who he's looking at, gesturing to come stand with him, just walks right past him onto the bridge and takes several steps out onto this narrow, rickety old thing. And then she stops, turns around, and gestures for David to come with her and walk across the entire bridge. And David, again, is having his second thoughts, but he sees Raquel wants to do this, and so he agrees to go. After they had walked about 100, maybe 200 feet across this bridge, the two of them just started laughing because it was totally exhilarating what they were doing. Not so much the quest for the Popelic monster, but rather the very real risk they were taking walking this tightrope bridge in the middle of the night. The couple would continue to very cautiously but quickly make their way across this bridge, and when they reached about the halfway point, when they were at the highest point from the ground, the bridge itself begins to shake. And then from behind them, they hear this loud grinding sound. And so the couple, they whip their heads around and they see there are these 2 bright glowing lights that are looking right at them all the way on the start of the bridge. And they realize it's a train. When Raquel and David walked up that dirt path and snuck through the fence and reached the top of the hill and could actually see the Popelic Trestle Bridge, they would have also seen the train tracks in the hillside that clearly extended onto the Popelic Trestle and went across the bridge. This was a train bridge. They would have seen that. But it's assumed that the couple, who didn't live in the area and so didn't know much about the Popelic Trestle, it's assumed they thought, well, this is a train bridge, but it's got to be abandoned. It certainly looks abandoned, and it does. It looks totally old. It does not look active, even though it is. Or the couple thought, well, this is just an old train bridge. It might be active, but surely no train is going to come through anytime soon. We can get across the bridge before a train arrives. But, of course, they were wrong. When the couple turned around and saw these two headlights bearing down on them, they quickly realized they would not be able to outrun this train. The train's clearly trying to stop. It has seen them. It's hitting its brakes. It's sounding its horn, but it's just clearly moving too quickly. So they cannot run to the other side to safety. And because this bridge was meant for a single train to pass through, there was no other track they could just jump onto to avoid being hit. And there were no walkways on either side of this railway. And so literally all they had was the track that this train was going to cross over, and they were on it. And so with no other choices, David yells to Raquel that they have to climb down and hang off the side of this bridge. Now, there were these wooden slats that ran underneath the rails. They ran perpendicular to the rails, and these wooden slats kind of extended off the edge of the bridge on either side just a couple of inches. And so in theory, if you were holding onto the outside of one of these wooden slats and kind of dangling off the edge of the bridge, a train could cross those tracks and not run over your hands or fingers. You would just have to hold on that whole time as the train is rumbling through. And so David, he flops down onto his stomach and he's trying to lower himself as fast as he can as this train is getting closer and closer, and he's yelling for Raquel to do the same thing, but she's not really moving very quickly. And finally, David, he gets in position. He's hanging off the edge of this bridge on these wooden slats, and he sees Raquel. She's not quite there, and then the train comes flying through. It strikes Raquel and sends her flying off the bridge to the ground below. David would somehow manage to hold on the whole time as this train went past him. And then once the train had passed him, he pulled himself back up onto the tracks. He ran the rest of the way across the bridge. He went down that hillside. And when he found Raquel, it was immediately apparent that she was deceased. In the end, the railroad was not issued any citations or sued for negligence. It was determined they did their due diligence by setting up that 8-foot-tall barbed wire fence with all those signs telling people to stay back and warning people about the hazards of going past this fence. And so it was actually David who got in trouble for this tragedy. He was cited and charged with a felony of unlawfully disrupting and or delaying a train, causing financial damages. He would plead to a lesser charge of trespassing and would be fined $2,300. Shockingly, this tragedy is just one of many that have occurred on the Pope Lick Trestle Bridge. Since the bridge's construction in the 1800s, there have been dozens of people who have died on this bridge. And several of these deaths, many of them fairly recent, the last 20 or so years, have occurred under the same conditions as Raquel's. People went looking for the Pope Lick monster and then were struck by a train. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to do the like button's dishes, but be sure to leave the cups and bowls right side up in their dishwasher. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We now have a podcast called the Mr. Ballen Podcast that puts out brand new exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we put out remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. That podcast is available on all platforms right now, but in just a couple of days, on November 1st, 2022, it will only be available on Amazon Music. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to mrballen.foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We also have 2 additional YouTube channels, Mr. Ballen Shorts and Mr. Ballen en Espanol. We also put out near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those channels are just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @Mr. Ballen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We also have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today's story is a classic, scary cabin in the forest story, but with a very big plot twist at the end. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is looking to adopt a pet, tell them you just rescued a puppy and you'd love for them to adopt it. And when they say yes, go ahead and drop your puppy off, but don't tell them that your puppy is actually a hangry saltwater crocodile. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of October 17th, 2019, a 47-year-old woman named Ada Quintal stepped out of her family's cabin in rural Michigan to take her dog for a walk and have a smoke. It was very late. It was about 1:30 in the morning. Now, this cabin where she was staying was very isolated. It was about a half mile away from any neighbors, but Ada actually enjoyed the solitude. She was surrounded on all sides by forest and swamps, and the wilderness actually made Ada feel a lot safer than when she was back home in the densely populated Detroit area where she lived full-time. And this was because just a few months earlier, when she had been back home in Detroit, she had been the victim of an unprovoked attack. She had been out in the city around all these people in broad daylight, and this guy came up to her and just jumped her, broke her nose, gave her a concussion, and then ran off. But the scariest part of this attack was not the fact that she had been brutalized. It was that this guy did not appear to have any reason to attack her. He didn't know Ada, and Ada had not been robbed or anything. It was like he just randomly identified her and attacked her. And the guy had never been caught. And so this ordeal had had such a profound impact on Ada that it really began to affect her health, both mentally and physically. She started to just kind of decline. And on top of that, she had been laid off from her engineering job, and so now she was unemployed and seriously depressed. And so recently, when Ada's uncle had called her and offered to pay her to come out and live in this 2-story family cabin and fix it up for the winter, Ada had jumped at the chance. I mean, not only would this solve her unemployment issue, but also she loved this cabin. It had been in her family for 75 years, and some of her fondest childhood memories were in this cabin. And so she looked at this as a chance to kind of get away from the city and just be in her happy place and kind of reset and recover from the trauma of the attack. And so for the past week, Ada and her boyfriend had been staying in this cabin and doing small repairs and cleaning it up. But 2 days earlier, her boyfriend had had to leave and go back to the city where they were actually fixing up another property, a condo. And so now it was just Ada and her dog. But that was totally fine with Ada. She liked being out here by herself, so this was no big deal. But tonight, she was feeling frustrated because she couldn't sleep. About an hour earlier, she had taken a pill to help her sleep, but so far it hadn't worked, and so she was feeling kind of wired and anxious, and so she had decided to go on a walk with her dog in hopes that that would clear her mind and allow her to finally get some rest. Now, these roads that surrounded this cabin were kind of small and zigzaggy, and there weren't any street lights. I mean, this is not exactly a good place to go for a nighttime walk. But Ada knew this place like the back of her hand, and she also carried a 9mm pistol in her pocket, just for protection. And so after walking for a few minutes down one of these dark, winding roads, Ada's dog stopped to relieve himself on a bush. So as the dog was going to the bathroom, Ada just casually smoked and waited. But at some point, the dog just stopped going to the bathroom, turned slightly, and began growling, and its ears perked up, and it was looking off into the darkness right ahead of them. And so Ada instinctively took her flashlight and raised it up and aimed it in the direction her dog was looking. And right away, the cone of light illuminated these 2 eyes looking right back at Ada. And immediately Ada knew what she was staring at. It was a mountain lion. And so doing her best to stay calm, Ada slowly reached into her pocket to pull out her gun, but before pulling it out, the 2 eyes blinked shut, and then she heard it kind of turn and run off into the forest. It was gone. Once Ada was sure the mountain lion really was gone, she breathed a sigh of relief, and then very quickly tugged on her dog's leash. They turned around, and she hustled back towards the cabin. When Ada reached her cabin, which was all lit up because she had left all the lights on before she had left, she jumped up the front steps, she opened up the door, she went inside with her dog, and after letting her dog off the leash, she shut and locked the door. Then she grabbed her phone and texted her boyfriend to tell him about this mountain lion. And then after hitting send, Ada felt relieved to be back in her cabin, but at the same time, she still felt very on edge. I mean, she had been, just a few feet away from a mountain lion in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. But as Ada was doing her best to calm herself down, she heard this noise coming from outside the living room window, almost like twig snapping, like somebody was walking past the window. And so the way this cabin was set up is when you first walked inside, you were in the kitchen, and then the back half of the cabin was a living room, and then there were also stairs leading up to a second floor. But from in the kitchen, you had a clear line of sight into the living room and vice versa. It was kind of like one big room with two functions. And so from where Ada was standing in the kitchen, she could clearly see the window in the living room where this noise had kind of come through. But because the inside of the cabin was all lit up and the outside was dark, from her perspective, all she could see was a reflection on that window. So to look outside that window to see what had made that noise, she would need to get right up next to the window. And so feeling pretty nervous at this point, she walked across the cabin, she made her way towards this window, and then she pressed her face right up against the glass to look outside. But all she saw outside was just darkness. I mean, there was nothing out there. And so Ada stepped back from the window and started to wonder if maybe the sound she had just heard was maybe that mountain lion. Maybe it followed her back here. That was terrifying, but at least she was inside. But also she was thinking to herself, mountain lions are not known for being aggressive towards humans, and they wouldn't come up to her cabin like this and prowl around outside. That's just not what mountain lions do. But Ada didn't really have any other explanation, and so she told herself, it's gotta be nothing, there's nothing out there, this is a safe place. And so she kind of forgot about the noise, and she took off her coat and put her stuff down, and then she sat down on the couch in the living room, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. But only about 20 minutes later, when Ada had finally relaxed and was even thinking about getting into her bed and going to sleep, she heard another noise coming from that same window in the living room. And this time, when she looked up and looked out that window, despite the reflections inside the cabin, she could clearly tell there was something moving outside of her cabin. And it was definitely not a mountain lion. It looked like a man. And so Ada had to stifle a scream, and then instinctively she lunged for her gun on the coffee table, and then darted behind the couch and crouched down to make sure whoever was out there couldn't see her. And then, with gun in hand, she began calling out to the person out there that, "Hey, I'm armed. If you come in here, I'm going to shoot you." But it was just silence. And then Ada strained her ears to try to hear any sound that would give away where this person went. Were they still outside that window? Had they moved somewhere else? But all she could hear was the sound of the wind whipping outside and an owl hooting off in the distance. But then, right as Ada was starting to wonder, did I really see somebody out there? Is this all in my head? That's when she heard the distinct sound of footsteps on her front porch. And so again, Ada had to stifle a scream, and she darted to the other side of the couch, preventing the person from the front of the house to seeing her now. Then she grabbed her phone and she was dialing 911, and she was about to hit call when she stopped herself. And she began to wonder, am I just totally overreacting here? I don't know if there's somebody out there. I could be hearing things. Or maybe it's just like an animal or something. And also, deep down, Ada knew that ever since that attack in Detroit that summer, that basically everything scared her. And she was starting to wonder if maybe she was just being totally paranoid and there was nothing going on. And she didn't want to embarrass herself by calling 911 and having them come out here and finding nothing. And so Ada decided she would call her boyfriend, and so she called her boyfriend, and as the phone is ringing, she's listening intently for any other footsteps outside, but she can't hear anything. And then her boyfriend, he didn't pick up. It's also like 2:30 in the morning at this point, but her boyfriend doesn't answer. And so after that, she tries calling one of her friends, and her friend does pick up. And right away, Ada just began telling this friend about all the things that had happened that night, from going out and seeing the mountain lion, and then coming back in, hearing the sound, and now hearing the footsteps on the front porch. And, she was worried that maybe she was just making it all up, but she was still really scared. And even though Ada was trying to be composed as she was telling her friend, her voice began to crack and she began to cry because she really was scared. And the friend just said, "Look, I'm going to call the police on your behalf. It seems like it's worth having them come out just to make sure you're really okay. Give me the address and I'll tell them where to go." And so Ada would give her friend the address, but she told the friend, "Thank you, but do not call right now. Just please stay on the phone for a minute and let me just do a quick investigation. Let me look out the windows, and just really make sure that this is nothing before you call the police." And so the friend said, "Okay, look around, but then I'm calling the police." And so, with her phone and her gun in hand, Ada very carefully crept out from behind the couch, keeping a low profile, staying below the sight line of all the windows. And she crept from the living room into the kitchen towards the front of the house, and she walked over to the sink, and she very slowly raised her head until she could just barely peek through the window right above the sink that overlooked the front porch. Because remember, that was the last place she had heard sounds, from the front porch. And so she very carefully peeks and looks out the window, and there's nothing there. Nobody's on the porch. It's just empty, dark forest. She's safe. Ada let out a relieved half cry, half laugh, and then stood all the way up and felt totally ridiculous because clearly she had just imagined, all these people wandering around the outside of her house. And so she was about to tell her friend that, hey, sorry, there is no issue here, don't call the police. But before she could get the words out, Ada happened to turn around and was looking back towards the living room, and she froze. Because there, in that same window she had heard those sounds coming from in the living room, was now the silhouettes of two men, clear as day, just looking in the window right at Ada. And so, acting purely on instinct, Ada just raised her gun and aimed it at these two men, and to her horror, the two men also raised guns and aimed them right back at Ada. And so Ada just started firing her gun at the window, and these men began shooting back at her, and right before Ada leapt to the ground, she was pretty sure she hit one of the men in the head with one of her rounds, and so she lands on the ground. It's absolute pandemonium at this point, and her friend, who's still on the phone, is screaming like, what's going on? What's going on? And all Ada could think to do was yell out, there's two men, they're shooting at me, I think I shot one of them. And the friend is screaming, I'm gonna call the police. And then the line goes dead, and Ada, who's crouched down behind the kitchen island at this point, she realizes all the shooting has stopped. It's now dead silent in the cabin. And so for a second, Ada was thinking to herself, maybe I managed to shoot both of them, and that's why it's quiet right now. But then another thought began to enter her head, that maybe she had only shot one of them, and the other survivor was moving into position to maybe ambush her. And so as she's running through what she's gonna do, she hears this horrible, loud thumping sound right above her in the second floor of the cabin. Now, Ada knew at this moment she should just get her dog and run. Because if this second shooter has survived and has now come into her cabin and is upstairs, that means the forest is now clear and she can make a run for it. But as she sat there by the island, still clutching her gun, in this beloved family cabin of hers, she began thinking about the fact that ever since that attack in Detroit over the summer, that had totally wrecked her life and made her scared of everything. And so as she heard the sound of whoever this was marching around in her second floor, she made a decision. She was going to stand her ground and fight. And so she took a deep breath, she stood up, and with gun in hand, she made her way to the stairs and began to go up. It's no secret that a lot of the stories I've covered over the years are about real people who have been victims of just unspeakable violence. And so that's why, back in April of 2022, we decided to launch the Mr. Ballen Foundation, which was established to honor and support victims of violent crime and their families. And so now, over 2 years later, I'm happy to report that, with your help, because none of this would be possible without all of you, we have been able to give $1.4 million to this group of people, to these victims and their families, who are often overlooked after the news story about whatever happened to them fades. All donations that are made to the Mr. Ballen Foundation, literally 100% of them, go out the door to the cause. Meaning if you give $10, that $10 is going to the victims, it's going to their families. This is one of the very rare nonprofits that can actually say that. If you're interested in joining the Mr. Ballen Foundation community and contributing to this effort, all you have to do is go to mrballen.foundation and click on Donate. Again, just go to mrballen.foundation and click on Donate. Thank you again to all our donors, our listeners, viewers, all the people that made this possible. We are genuinely changing the world. Thank you so much, and now back to the story. The police arrived at the cabin about 30 minutes later because Ada's friend did call the police, and she warned them that as far as she knew, there could be at least 2 gunmen there, and maybe Ada had shot one of them. She wasn't sure. And so when the police arrived, they showed up, guns drawn, and they walked up to the cabin and they searched the outside, but there was nobody out there. It was silent. And then when they made entry into the cabin, they saw clearly there had been a shootout. I mean, there were bullet holes all over the place, broken windows, but after searching the cabin top to bottom, they didn't find anybody. No Ada, no shooters. However, they did find Ada's terrified dog inside of the cabin, and the dog would be just fine. Now, once the cabin was secured of any threats, the police would do another comprehensive search looking for any evidence that would kind of tell them, where Ada or these shooters had gone. And during this secondary search, they would find Ada's shoes and her cell phone on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find her gun on the ground not far from the roof, suggesting maybe she had fallen off the roof or jumped from the roof, but they were kind of located roughly in the same area. And during this secondary search, they wouldn't find Ada or the gunman, but they would find Ada's cell phone and her shoes on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find Ada's gun on the ground not far from where her shoes and cell phone had been found. But that was it. Police immediately launched a massive search in the forest surrounding the cabin, but despite looking all over the place, they could not find any signs of Ada or her attackers. Police checked local hospitals to see if maybe the man that Ada had shot had shown up seeking medical attention, but as far as they could tell, he hadn't. And so pretty quickly, the police theorized that maybe there were no gunmen. Maybe what really happened here is Ada's boyfriend attacked her, and he was responsible for whatever happened to her. But when police checked on Ada's boyfriend, it would turn out he had a rock-solid alibi. He had been with Ada's adult son at the time Ada had gone missing, and Ada's own son said, yes, for sure, he was with me. He did not do this. But after that, the police thought, okay, well, maybe if Ada's boyfriend didn't do this, maybe he hired other people to hurt Ada. But there was no evidence of any strange financial transactions, and as far as they could tell when they did some digging, there was no strife in Ada and her boyfriend's relationship. So there was no clear reason why he would want to hurt her. And so that lead also kind of fell flat. Police would confirm that Ada was attacked that previous summer by this random guy in Detroit, and so for a little while they speculated that, maybe this guy, this attacker, who had never been caught, had maybe tracked Ada down to finish off the job. But that seemed so far-fetched and just unlikely that that basically was shut down as well. And as the days passed, the evidence that was coming in only made the case more confusing. For example, there were all these bullets fired during this big shootout in the cabin, and when they examined the actual bullets they extracted from the walls and the floor and the ceiling, they were all from Ada's gun. However, outside and inside the cabin, they found all these different shell casings, suggesting that those bullets had been fired from different weapons, i.e., maybe the attacker's weapons. And so as the weeks passed by and Ada and her attackers were not found, people began to speculate that, maybe this was all an elaborate setup by Ada just so she could disappear. Or other people thought maybe she was abducted by aliens. I mean, there were lots of theories surrounding this, but basically nobody knew what happened. And then pretty soon, the case just went completely cold. That is, until December 21st, 2019, so about 2 months after Ada's disappearance. And on that day, Ada's family decided to drain a pond that was near that cabin in the woods. At this point, the family was so desperate for closure that they were prepared to do just about anything to find Ada and to figure out what happened to her. And so even though this pond had previously been searched by the police, they drained this pond, and sure enough, they find Ada. She was deceased, and her body was found about 300 yards away from the cabin, and she was covered in only about a foot of water. Now, initially, the speculation was, well, here you go. She must have been chased out of her cabin by these attackers, and she was shot and killed, and this is where she fell. But after a quick examination of her body, it was clear she had no bullet wounds on her anywhere. In fact, she didn't even have any bruises on her or any major scrapes or cuts or anything, so it didn't even seem like she had been in any sort of physical struggle at all before she died. In fact, unless she had drowned, it really just seemed totally unclear how she had died. It was not until the medical examiner did Ada's autopsy that all this baffling evidence began to make sense. It would turn out, in the wake of that horrible random attack that Ada had suffered over the summer, that Ada was actually doing far worse than she let on to her family and friends. She had basically begun to cope with her trauma and anxiety with substance abuse. And so on the night that she had died, she was likely feeling totally stressed out and anxious, and she couldn't sleep as a result. And so she had taken some Valium, which is a fairly strong sedative, and also some anti-anxiety medication. But after taking those pills, she still wasn't tired. And so that was when she decided to, go out for a walk with her dog, to clear her head, and have a smoke. But it was not cigarettes that she was smoking. She was smoking methamphetamine, known simply as meth. And meth is a very strong stimulant that people like because it makes them feel very strong and confident and alert, which for Ada was a powerful antidote to the helplessness she was feeling all the time from the attack she had suffered that summer. But one of the many downsides of meth is that it can make you extremely paranoid. And so during her walk that night, as she's smoking meth, she sees a mountain lion, which terrifies her. And then after the mountain lion trots off, it was like that jolt of adrenaline and fear from seeing the mountain lion didn't subside because of smoking meth. It was like the meth sent her into this paranoia overdrive that she couldn't escape from. And so when Ada went back inside of her cabin, she very likely did see people in her windows. But almost certainly it was just her own reflection. But again, she's in this meth-induced paranoid state. And so instead of realizing it was her own reflection, she thought it was like intruders coming to get her. And before long, she'd raised her gun and thought the people outside were raising their gun back at her. But again, it's just her reflection. And so when she was shooting, she was basically having a shootout with herself. And then as for, the strange noises she was hearing, like the footsteps on the second floor, very likely those were just natural sounds kind of happening outside. She's out in the middle of a forest. There's lots of noises that are totally natural at night. But again, she's in this paranoid state, and so she went upstairs to confront the person, and then didn't see anybody, and then police theorized that she must have, climbed out onto the roof to hide from these attackers, and then at some point, for reasons unknown, she leapt from the roof or climbed down or something, leaving behind her cell phone and shoes on the roof. She left her gun on the ground, and then she ran off into the forest, where she ultimately collapsed, 300 yards away in a foot of water, where she died not from drowning, but from a combination of hypothermia and also a toxic combination of drugs in her system. And so in the end, the danger that Ada was trying to escape was in her own mind. Before I became a professional, strange, dark, and mysterious storyteller, I served in the military. And during my time in the military, I had some pretty wild experiences. But what I remember most about my time in service was not my own stories, but rather the stories I heard from other service members. Keep in mind, service members are sent to some of the most isolated and treacherous places in the world that very few people go to. And so some of the stories that come out of those places are totally creepy and weird. And even more than that, a lot of these stories sort of stay in-house. They stay in the military just because it's kind of a cultural thing. People don't necessarily want to go out and tell the world about the totally unsettling and inexplicable thing they saw while they were deployed. It's like people might think they were crazy. But there's lots of stories like that. And so if hearing some of those crazy military stories appeals to you, well, boy, do I have a podcast for you. It's called Wartime Stories, and it's hosted by Luke LaManna, who himself is a veteran. He was a reconnaissance Marine, which I can tell you is kind of a big deal. And so because he has access and placement, he's been able to extract some of these stories from the military, and he shares them on the show. And if you wanted to kind of generalize the types of stories you're going to hear on this podcast, it's like the strange, dark, and mysterious meets the battlefield and beyond. The Wartime Stories podcast is free, and it's available on any podcast platform. So all you have to do is, go to your favorite platform and look up Wartime Stories, or you can search for Ballen Studios because it's produced under Ballen Studios. You click on the show, give it a follow, and boom, you can start your binge. New episodes drop every Monday, so if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, well, you got yourself a brand new weekly show. So that's going to do it. If you want more strange, dark, and mysterious content, remember we have a whole host of strange, dark, and mysterious podcasts under the Ballen Studios umbrella. We have the Mr. Ballen podcast, Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, we have Wartime Stories, we have Run Fool. They are awesome, they are free, there are tons and tons of episodes out there to binge right now. All you have to do is go to any podcast platform, look up Ballen Studios, and boom, there you go. Thank you so much for all your support. Until next time, see ya. In 2008, a young man was driving along a dirt road in a forest when he spotted up ahead this large, strange-looking animal that he didn't recognize that appeared to be dead on the side of the road. And so, curious what it was, he drove past the dead animal and he stopped his car and he got out and began walking back up the road towards the animal to see what it was. And when he got right on top of it, he crouched down to get a better look, and as he did, he heard the sound of something moving behind him. And then before he could turn around, everything went black. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come on over your house for a nice, fun, casual game night, and as soon as they step inside, immediately ambush them, handcuff them to the bed, and have a priest perform an exorcism on them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In 2008, 22-year-old Julian Buchwald was living in a small rural town in southern Australia called Budgeree. He lived there with his parents, who owned a small house on a massive 1,200-acre plot of land, which for reference is about 2 square miles. However, this land was made up mostly of thick brush and forested areas, so for the most part, they just stayed close to their actual house. However, there was a waterfall deep into the woods on their property that periodically they would go to visit. Less than a 20-minute drive north of Budgeree was another small rural town called Churchill, and in that town was Julian's girlfriend, 17-year-old Carolyn Watson, who also lived with her parents. The young couple had met 2 years earlier at the church they both went to. They were both very devout Christians, and their plan was to get married the next year when Carolyn turned 18 and was done with her studies. On Tuesday, March 4th of that year, Julian and Carolyn decided to go out and have a picnic lunch at the waterfall on Julian's family's property. So early that afternoon, Julian left his house, he hopped in the family car, he drove north to Churchill, he picked up Carolyn, and then he drove her back to his family's property, where he turned onto a dirt road that would take them into the forest to the waterfall. At some point along this short, bumpy road through the forest, Julian was looking out ahead of the car when he spotted what looked like roadkill on the side of the road. And this roadkill, it looked bigger than he was used to seeing in this area. And so he stared at it as the car kind of rolled past it. And right after they had driven past the roadkill, he turned to Carolyn and said, hey, there's some really weird roadkill on the side of the road right over there. And so Carolyn, who really didn't care, she kind of slowly looked up and turned around and looked, but she didn't see it. And then after that, the two of them did not discuss the roadkill any further. And so Julian just continued to drive along this dirt road until the road kind of opened up into this big clearing. And in the middle of this clearing, which was basically this field, there was a small pond with a 10-foot high waterfall feeding into it. This was the waterfall. And so Julian parked the car right at the end of the dirt road, right on the edge of this clearing. And he and Carolyn got out. They went around to the back of the car. They got their picnic supplies out of the trunk, and they set up their picnic lunch right on the edge of this pond, looking up at this waterfall. And they were there for about an hour, just kind of enjoying each other's company. And then around 2:30 p.m., they realized it was time to go because they had told their family they'd be back by 3. And so they packed up all of their picnic stuff. They went back to the car. They put it back in the trunk. They hopped back inside the car. Julian turned it on. He turned the car around, and they began driving back down the dirt road that had brought them in. And as soon as they began driving down this road, Julian remembered the strange roadkill he had seen on their way in. And he decided that he wanted to stop and get out and actually go up to it. And so as they're driving along, he looks over at Carolyn and says, "Hey, do you mind if I stop the car when I see the roadkill so I can go look at it?" And Carolyn looked at him and she's like, "Okay, but remember, we have to be back by 3 p.m. That's what we told our families, so please be quick." And so Julian said, "No problem." And so he continued driving along, scanning for this roadkill. But after driving for several minutes, he had not found the roadkill yet. And he started to become worried that he had just driven past it without realizing it. And so he stopped the car. They're pretty close to the end of this dirt road. They're almost back to Julian's property. But he stops the car right in the middle of this dirt road. And he turns to Carolyn and says, "Hey, I think I drove past it. Do you mind if I just hop out and run back?" And so Carolyn was totally annoyed that this roadkill viewing was really becoming quite involved. But she says, "Okay, go. But again, you got to be quick because, it's almost 3 p.m. And so Julian kind of grinned at her. He put the car in park and he hopped out, he turned, and he began jogging back down the road in the direction of the waterfall. And after jogging for maybe 30 seconds or so, the road had turned to the right. And so from where he was on the road, if he turned around, he would not have been able to see his car or Carolyn. He was kind of deep in the thick of this forest. But he knew, this road is not very long, and so I'm sure the roadkill has got to be up here somewhere. And so he decided he would just continue running back along this road for maybe 1 or 2 more minutes, and if he didn't find the roadkill by then, he'd just have to give up, turn around, and head back to the car. And so he began jogging, continuing towards the waterfall on this dirt road, and sure enough, after about a minute, he spots off to the side the roadkill. And so he runs up to it, and right away he sees it's this huge animal that's right on the side of the road. There was a branch from a tree that had kind of obscured the carcass a little bit, and he figured that's why on the return trip he hadn't seen it, because this branch was kind of blocking it from view. And so standing over it, still not even sure what it is, he reached down and he moved the branch, the tree branch, out of the way to get a better look at this big dead animal. And right as he did that, everything went black. A few minutes later, Carolyn, who was still sitting in the car waiting for her boyfriend to come back, looked at her watch and realized it was getting really close to 3 p.m. and still Julian was not back yet. And so feeling kind of annoyed with him, she sat up in her seat and turned around and looked out the rear window of the car, expecting to see Julian come bounding down the road toward her. But when she looked out the back window, all she saw was this dirt road that kind of bent off to the right out of view and thick trees everywhere. Her boyfriend is nowhere to be seen. Annoyed, she turned back around and sat facing forward again, but began periodically looking in the side view mirror, expecting Julian to pop up at any moment. But after several more minutes went by and still Julian had not come back yet, her annoyance turned into concern. Was Julian actually okay? And so she decided, it's almost 3 p.m. now. We got to get back. I need to get out and actually go investigate and see what's going on with Julian and this roadkill. And so she opened her car door. She stepped outside. She stood up. She turned and she looked down the road in the direction it turned to the right towards the waterfall. And she froze because there was something standing right in the middle of the road that her brain simply couldn't process. She wanted to turn and run. She wanted to scream for help, but she couldn't. She was just frozen with fear, staring at this thing in the middle of the road. And then seconds later, this thing that she saw in the road began moving toward her. Around 3:30 p.m. that day, Julian's mother, who was at the house, realized her son had still not come back from his picnic. And this was very unlike him. He was extremely punctual. And so she stepped out onto the front porch to wait for him. But after waiting on the front porch for 30 minutes and him not showing up again, she got really concerned. And so she left the porch and went down onto their driveway, and their driveway extended right up to the main road that ran along the front of the house. And when she reached the top of her driveway, she just turned and watched down the main road, waiting for her son to come back. Because in order to get to the waterfall, you had to get on this main road and then turn onto that dirt road that was a little ways down this main road. And so she's just standing there looking down the road, waiting for her son, but he's still not coming out of that dirt road. And as she's looking in this direction, she happens to glance along the chain link fence that ran along the front of her property. And she noticed there was a plastic bottle that had been jammed through one of the chain links. And so she decided she would just go over and see what it was, because it didn't make any sense that there would be a bottle in her fence. And so she walks over, she pulls the bottle out of the fence, and she realizes there is a tightly rolled piece of paper that's inside of the bottle. And so she unscrews the cap, she turns the bottle over, and she pours this little piece of paper out. She unfurls the piece of paper and sees there's writing on it. And as she's reading it, her heart starts to race and she covers her mouth. This note was clearly intended for her to read, or someone in the family to read that day, because it was about what happened to Julian and Carolyn that day. The note, which was covered in all these strange satanic symbols and was barely understandable because the grammar and spelling was so terrible, it generally communicated that Julian and Carolyn, who they called the boy and the girl, had been kidnapped. And so long as the family did not contact police, they, the boy and the girl, Julian and Carolyn, would be returned. It didn't really specify what they were going to do to them, and there was no ransom. It basically just said, you better not tell police or else. Well, Julian's mother was terrified. She had no idea what to do, and despite this threat of some sort of harm to her children, to her family, if she went to police, she still called the police. And so the police, they came out to her property, they inspected the note, and right away, they noticed at the bottom of the note, it was signed with the initials ONA. And so those initials, combined with these strange satanic symbols all over it, led police to discover who ONA was. ONA was a cult. It was the Order of Nine Angles, and they are a self-professed satanic cult that operates primarily in Europe, but also has chapters in the United States, in Canada, in Russia, and also in Australia. This cult believes that Christians are the enemy of the world, and they need to be destroyed in order to institute a militaristic New World Order they called the Imperium. And if that wasn't frightening enough, this cult openly advocates for, and apparently practices, human sacrifice. They have come out and said the people they kill in these sacrifices are people they consider lesser thans, basically the bad people of society. And if you are an ONA cult member, then who better to sacrifice than Julian and Carolyn, two devout Christians, and so two clear enemies of the ONA. Now, at first, when the police saw this note and kind of put this together, they're thinking, this has got to be a prank. I mean, Carolyn and Julian have only been gone for a couple of hours at this point, and all we have is this note in a bottle stuck into the fence. This does not seem like some huge conspiracy of a cult coming in here and snatching these kids to commit some human sacrifice. But when Carolyn's parents found out about this note and how they were still missing, they would tell the police, 10 days ago, we received a letter in the mail that had strange satanic symbols all over it, and it really didn't make any sense. It basically was threatening them not to go to police, but 10 days ago, they had no reason to go to police, and so they just didn't really understand why they received this message or who had sent it, and so they had just kind of dismissed it and not told anyone. But now, with these two notes looking nearly identical, it seemed fairly obvious that whether it was the ONA or some other person or group, whoever was behind the kidnapping of Julian and Carolyn had clearly been watching both of their properties prior to the attack, which meant this was likely a more sophisticated kidnapping than it seemed. So that evening, the police launched this huge air and land search all over Julian's family's property, but despite looking everywhere, they found no sign of the young couple. There was just nothing. And over the next few days, when still there was just no sign of Julian or Carolyn, and there was no more word coming in from ONA, there were no more bottles stuck in fences or stuck in mailboxes, the police began to prepare for the worst. Then something totally unexpected happened. On March 11th, so 7 days after Carolyn and Julian went missing, a farmer was driving along this winding back road up in the mountains right near Alpine National Park. Alpine National Park is this very rugged, mountainous place that's about 250 miles to the north of Budgery. And so as this guy is driving along this road, which is very heavily forested on either side, he sees up ahead this young man and young woman who are barely wearing any clothes, come stumbling out of the forest and kind of plop down on the side of the road. And so concerned they're hurt or they're lost or something, the farmer rolled right up next to them and he rolled his window down and asked, hey, are you guys okay? And they got up and they kind of stumbled their way over to the car and they introduced themselves as Carolyn and Julian and they pleaded for his help. And so the farmer helped them into his car and he drove them to the hospital. It wasn't long before the police in Budgery learned that Carolyn and Julian had been found and they were alive. And so very quickly they rushed up to that hospital near the national park. And when they got there, they spoke to doctors who would say, Carolyn and Julian are very traumatized. They're horribly sunburned. They're covered in bug bites. They got cuts and bruises all over them, but they're okay. They're going to survive. And so the police went into Julian and Carolyn's room. And at first, they just talked to them for a couple of minutes to really see that they were okay. And after feeling pretty confident that they were, they said, look, I don't mean to just jump right into the trauma you've just experienced, but we really need any information you can give us about what just happened. Who did this to you? Who brought you out here? Because if it's ONA and they're out in the Alpine National Park, we need to know about it. We need to get out there and we need to stop them. And so Julian and Carolyn would both independently sit down and tell the police what happened to them. And so the following is the combined story of these two accounts that they gave police. But before we get into that, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Current. Banking is one of the few industries that has yet to be modernized by technology. It's dominated by a bunch of old companies that would happily take you out on a nice seafood dinner and never call you again. But with Current, which is the future of money management, you'd get that call back, and they'll even give you directions to Bell's Canyon. Because Current was built from the ground up with you in mind. They want you to get your money faster, they want you to move your money faster, and they have the tools to help you spend and save your money better than ever. With Current, there are a bunch of perks, but a few of them include getting your paycheck 2 days earlier, not getting charged overdraft fees up to $200, and there are no minimum balance fees. Also, Current's savings plan, just called Interest, comes with a whopping 4% APY, which in layman's terms means it will generate you 60 times the American national average. And if that wasn't incentive enough, Current and I are once again giving away $500 to 10 of you. All you gotta do is sign up using my code BALLEN500. So go download Current today and use my code BALLEN500 for a chance to win the money. Okay, back to the story. And so again, here is the account that both Julian and Carolyn gave to police. 7 days earlier, when Julian had gotten out of the car and ran back down the road to that dead animal on the side of the road, and he had reached down to kind of get that branch out of the way to get a better look at this thing, he heard sudden movement behind him, and as he turned, he didn't have a chance to see what was behind him, but he felt something hard smash him in the back of the head, and it knocked him unconscious. When he woke up, he knew right away that a significant amount of time had passed, that he had been unconscious for what must have been several hours, because now it was dark out, and when he was struck, it was broad daylight, and he looked around him and he had no idea where he was. He was in the middle of this forest, he had no clothes on, his wrists and his ankles were tied together, and he moved around and he realized he had been tied to a tree that was right behind him. And so he's got no idea what's going on, he has no idea where he is, he's looking around, he doesn't see anyone, and then amazingly, when he looks down, right next to him, underneath some leaves, is a knife. And so he's thinking, how in the world is there a knife right next to me? This almost seems like it was placed to be here for me. But either way, he reaches down with his hands, he picks this knife up, and he's able to cut the restraints off of his ankles, and then he's able to cut the restraints off of his waist, and then he stands up and he's able to kind of cut off the ones on his wrist, and then he's free. And so he takes this knife and he has no idea where he's going, but he needs to get away. He doesn't know if whoever brought him here is going to come back. And so he just picks a direction and he starts running. Shortly after Julian had been struck in the back of the head after looking at that dead animal carcass, Carolyn was still sitting in the car and she was starting to get annoyed and kind of worried about Julian. And so she gets out of the car, she stands up, she turns, and she looks down the dirt road where it kind of bends off to the right. And standing in the road, maybe 10 feet away from her, is this man wearing all black. He's got a black balaclava over his face, and he's looking right at her. And so she's so scared, she just frozen to the spot. And then this guy charges her, he tackles her to the ground, and then once she's on the ground, he rips all her clothes off, and then he binds her wrists, her ankles, he ties them together so she's hog-tied, and then he puts a blindfold around her eyes. And so she's lying on the road, she can't move, she can't see anything, and she hears her attacker run off down the road. And then a couple of minutes later, she hears a car approaching, and it stops right near her, and then she hears the sound of a car door opening, someone walking up to her, and then they pick her up and they put her in the trunk of this car, they shut the trunk, and then the car kicks into gear and it starts driving away. And so for hours and hours, she lay in the trunk in this horrible position where the circulation to her wrists and to her ankles were cut off. And so she's getting shooting pain in her limbs, and it's totally uncomfortable. And then after several hours, the car eventually turns on to some really bumpy road, and then it comes to a stop. And then she hears the sound of the driver open the door. They walk around to the back of the car. The trunk pops open. And then this person pulls the blindfold off of her eyes. And she sees, even though her eyes are taking a second to adjust, that it's the man with the balaclava on. And he picks her up and he throws her on the ground. And then after he shuts the trunk, he walks over to Carolyn and he grabs her by the wrists and he begins dragging her into the woods. And so as she's being dragged, Carolyn is thinking, I'm about to be killed somewhere in the middle of the woods. There's nothing I can do? I can't go anywhere. I can't do anything. And after several minutes of being dragged, she gets dropped. And then this man with the balaclava, he walks back to the car and he gets a shovel. And when he walks over to her, he makes a special point of showing her the shovel. And then he rolls her onto her side so she's positioned in such a way that she can see what he's doing. And then right in front of her, he takes that shovel and he begins digging a hole in the ground. And so Carolyn's watching him and she's thinking, he's digging my grave. And so for several hours, Carolyn just laid there wondering what was going to happen to her as this guy dug this hole deeper and deeper into the ground. And then finally, when the hole was apparently deep enough, the guy got out of the hole, he dumped the shovel, he walked over to her, he picked her up, and he threw her into the hole. And so Carolyn at this point is literally anticipating death at any moment. She doesn't know how he's going to kill her, but she thinks it's going to happen any minute. And so she wriggles herself onto her knees and does the only thing she can think to do, which is just to pray. And so as she's sitting there kneeling and praying, she hears the sound of her attacker walking off. Now, the hole was deep enough that she actually could not see where he was going, but she could clearly tell he was walking away. It was almost like her prayer had been answered, that this guy was going to leave her alone. But even with this guy potentially gone, she was still in a perilous situation because she's stuck in this hole. She can't go anywhere. She's still tied up, and the temperatures are dropping rapidly, and she's got no clothes on. After Julian had managed to free himself from his restraints with that knife that he found, and after he had turned and just started running in a general direction, he had begun yelling out for help. He knew that by yelling out, he very likely could be alerting the person who had brought him here. But he's thinking, it's freezing, I don't have clothes on, I have to get help right now. And maybe Carolyn is out there. And so he's just kind of yelling out for help. And at some point, a voice yells back to him, and it's a voice he knows very well. It's Carolyn. And so in the darkness, he's kind of fumbling through all the trees and he's listening for Carolyn's voice. And finally, he reaches her and he finds her in this hole, hogtied, screaming out for him. And so there's this moment where he kind of explains what happened to him, and she's trying to explain what happened to her, but they're just so scared that this attacker is going to come back that Julian just hops into the hole, he cuts her restraints, and then Julian helps Carolyn out of the hole. And at this point, Carolyn can barely walk because the circulation had been cut off for the most part to her legs for the better part of 6, 7, 8 hours at this point. But still, they're desperate to get out of here. So Julian's kind of holding Carolyn up, and they begin to walk away from this hole site. And as they're leaving, they begin scanning around the area in case, this attacker has left something else on the ground, because Julian had said, I found a knife near where I was being held. And sure enough, as they're leaving, not far from the hole, they spot lying up against a tree a sleeping bag, and rolled up inside of the sleeping bag was some food and some water. And so Julian and Carolyn, they can't understand how in the world this has happened. Both the horrible luck of being kidnapped and brought out here, and the unbelievable luck of finding life-saving supplies just laying nearby. But either way, they grab the sleeping bag, they grab the food and water, and they take off running. For the next 48 hours, the couple roasted during the daytime when the sun was out because the temperatures would climb significantly. There wasn't much shade where they were walking around, so they're getting horribly sunburned. And then at night, the temperatures would plummet and they'd be freezing cold, and they'd get inside of their one sleeping bag and they'd shiver together and do their best to ration some food and water. And they're telling themselves, to stay positive, that eventually if they just keep on moving every day, they're going to find a person, they're going to find a road, they're going to find something that will save them. But to their horror, at the end of those first 48 hours, as they're stumbling through this mountainous, treacherous terrain, they found themselves stumbling back into the same area they had tried to run away from. There was the hole in the ground where Carolyn had been thrown inside of. They had accidentally, over the past 2 days, walked in a big circle. Now, luckily, when they arrived back at this site, there was no one there. The attacker was long gone, and it would turn out this accident likely saved their lives, because as they looked at this site, they saw propped up against a tree was a backpack. And so they ran over to the backpack, they opened it up, and there was food, water, some clothing, and a map of the area. Now, again, the couple is totally dumbfounded why they are just happening to find these life-saving supplies right when they need them. But at the same time, they're thinking, okay, well, if these supplies are sitting here, then certainly the person who has left them here, their attacker, they're going to be back soon. And so they just grabbed the backpack with everything inside of it and they took off running. And for the next 5 days, they used that map as best as they could, and they eventually stumbled their way through the terrain, roasting during the daytime and freezing at night. And eventually they reached that road where they stumbled out, and the farmer driving along the back road, he spotted them and he brought them to the hospital. After hearing this story, the police very quickly organized a massive search around the area of Alpine National Park where the farmer picked up Julian and Carolyn, because they're thinking, okay, it's got to be right around here that we'll find the man in the balaclava that might lead us to the ONA, or maybe he's not connected to the ONA, but whoever he is, we need to find this guy. And so the police, they go out, they do this huge search. They don't find the man with the balaclava. They don't find any sign of the ONA, but they do find that area where that hole had been dug that Carolyn had been thrown in. And when they searched that area, they found the shovel, they found some rope, and they found some duct tape. And when they brought that in to be examined, they couldn't believe what they discovered. All of those items belonged to Julian, which meant either the kidnapper had taken all of these supplies from Julian right before going out and perpetrating this kidnapping, or, much more likely, Julian had supplied these things to the kidnapper and so was involved in some way in this kidnapping. And so the police went to Julian and confronted him with this information and said, "You're not telling us everything because these are your items." And at first, Julian would completely deny any accusations that he had anything to do with this. But after some very serious police pressure was put on him, he cracked. The following is the real story of what happened. Back on March 4th, so the day that Julian and Carolyn went missing, Julian, after picking Carolyn up, they made it onto that dirt road that led into the forest towards the waterfall, and as they're driving along, Julian claimed to have seen some roadkill, some very strange roadkill on the side of the road. And so when Carolyn kind of turned around to look and didn't see it, Julian made it seem like, oh, well, we drove past it, that's why you didn't see it. But in reality, there was never any roadkill. That was completely made up. There was no roadkill. All Julian was doing was creating something that would allow him to then get out of the car at the end of their trip. And so they drive the rest of the way into the waterfall, they have their picnic, they turn around, they head back, and then again, Julian says, "Hey, Carolyn, do you mind if I, get out to look at the roadkill?" And so she says yes, and then he acts like, "Oh, we must have driven past it, so I need to get out and run back if I want to go see it." So Carolyn, she's not thinking it's totally strange. She says, okay, and so he hops out and he runs his way, he goes around that curve in the road, out of sight. There's no roadkill. Instead, he makes his way to a tree where days earlier he had stashed his all-black outfit, his black balaclava, and his knife, his shovel, his rope, his duct tape. It was all stashed in this spot that was going to be out of view of where Carolyn was. And so after getting all dressed up, he turned and began walking back towards Carolyn and his car. And when he turned the corner, he saw Carolyn was already standing outside of the car. And so he charged her, he tackled her to the ground, he ripped her clothes off, he hog-tied her, he threw her in his car, and then he got all of his supplies, he threw those in the car too, and he began driving away. And for 6 hours, he drove north all the way up to Alpine National Park, and then when he got there, he found a road that would kind of go off the trail a ways into the forest, at which point he opened the trunk, he pulled Carolyn out, he threw her on the ground, he dragged Carolyn into the woods, and then with her blindfold off, he made sure to show her the shovel, and he began digging that hole to give her the impression that he was going to kill her and bury her. He really wanted her to be totally terrified. And then after he had dug this hole, he dumped her into the hole. And then when she couldn't see what he was doing because she's deep inside of this hole and she's all tied up, he ran away. And when he was far enough out of view, he took off all of his clothes and kind of stashed it near a tree. And then completely naked, besides his knife, which would be his alibi for how he had gotten free, he began moving back towards the site where he knew Carolyn was in this hole. And then after waiting a little bit, he began yelling out for help. And then she heard him. And so she yells back to him, "Yo, Julian, I'm over here." And so Julian goes to the sound of her voice. And then when he sees her, he pitches her this ridiculous story about how he was tied up over there, but he found this knife and he was able to cut himself free. And look, I'll cut you free. And oh, the attacker's going to come back soon. And so he helps her out of the hole. And oh, look, they left a sleeping bag and some food and water. Let's go. And so he grabs the supplies and they head off into the bush. Now, the whole time, over the course of these 7 days, Julian knew exactly where he was. And so when they accidentally went in a circle and arrived back at the site where the hole was and then found that backpack that had more food and more water and some more supplies, that was intentional. That was not an accident. He had left the backpack there, and so that's why they had doubled back. And then 5 days later, after scampering through the wilderness, they magically found the road. But again, Julian knew where the road was. He had intentionally stayed out for the days that they were out there. And so after Julian tells the police all this, they say to him, was Carolyn in on this? I mean, did she know this was going on? And he said no. The whole time she believed they were getting stalked by their attacker. And if they ever caught up to them, they would be killed. And so the police are like, okay, well, why did you do this? Julian would say, he and Carolyn were both very committed to their faith, and they both believed in not having sex before marriage. But over time, Julian had gotten to the point where he just couldn't wait any longer to have sex with Carolyn, and they weren't scheduled to get married for another year. And he just did not think he could wait a full year before they could finally have intercourse. And so he had staged this entire kidnapping in order to hopefully coerce Carolyn into having sex with him. And so while he and Carolyn were out on the run in Alpine National Park for those 7 days and nights, they were not wearing any clothes or barely wearing any clothes. And at night, they only had that one sleeping bag that Julian had intentionally staged in advance. He knew they would have that one sleeping bag. And so they would climb into that bag at night because it's freezing cold out. And as they're laying there right on top of each other, he would say to Carolyn, we need to have sex in order to produce enough heat that we don't freeze to death out here. But Carolyn, despite the circumstances, every time said no. And so after 7 days of trying to convince Carolyn that they had to have sex, it was a matter of life or death, and that if they just said their vows, that under the eyes of God, they would be considered married and sex would be okay at that point, despite all of his best efforts, every single time, Carolyn just continued to say no, no, no. And so at the end of those 7 days, Julian finally just gave up. And so that's when they magically made their way out to the road and were rescued. Julian would also tell police that he was the one who wrote those notes prior to the kidnapping in hopes that they would believe the Order of the Nine Angles was behind all of this and he wouldn't get in trouble. Prior to his trial for kidnapping, Julian was out on bail and he decided he would just try to flee Australia. And so the way he did this is he dyed his skin a darker shade, and he also dyed his hair darker, and then he attempted to use a fake Indian passport to go to India. And he was able to fool Australian authorities, but when he arrived in India, he was immediately found out and he was extradited back to Australia where he would stand trial. And in 2009, he was found guilty of kidnapping along with a host of other obscure charges, and he was sentenced to 7 years and 9 months in prison. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to come on over your house for a nice, fun, casual game night. And as soon as they step inside, immediately ambush them, handcuff them to the bed, and have a priest perform an exorcism on them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast called the Mr. Ballen Podcast, where we put out brand new, never before heard stories on Monday mornings. These are podcast exclusives. You can only get them on the podcast. On Thursday mornings, we do re-uploads of old YouTube videos. So again, it's just called the Mr. Ballen Podcast, and you can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google. Basically, anywhere you find your podcasts, you can find it there. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on every platform is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called Mr. Ballen Shorts, where we put out random short videos and lost episodes, and the other channel is called Mr. Ballen en Español, and it's a Spanish language channel. We also have a Facebook page just called @MrBallen that puts out near daily content, and we have a Snapchat channel just called Mr. Ballen that puts out content every Sunday. We have some really cool merchandise, so head over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today marks the beginning of our annual Scarathon, where for the entire month of October, all I do is tell you true, scary campfire stories. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to sing at the Like Button's wedding for free, and then when it's time for their first dance, sing a rendition of Du Hast by Ramstein in an Australian accent. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In June of 2019, an 18-year-old girl named Bella wrapped up her first year in college and headed home for the summer. Her family lived just outside of this small town in France that was tucked up in the mountains and surrounded by this huge forest. And so growing up, Bella spent a lot of her time out in this forest, either by herself or with her father or other members of her family. And so she knew the forest like the back of her hand. Her favorite place to go in this forest was the man-made lake that sat kind of at the center of this forest. It wasn't huge, but it was a beautiful view, it was very peaceful, and so she liked going out there. The way she would get to it is she would leave her house, she would hop in her car, she would drive a couple of miles down the road, and she would pull off into the shoulder of this road, and there was no signage that said this was the pull-off to get to the man-made lake. This was an area that she and her family had discovered, that there was this particular trail you could take. And so she would pull off at this shoulder, she would get out, and she would turn away from the road and just walk directly into the trees, which butted right up against the road. And very quickly, after walking into the woods, after going through some thick underbrush, she would reach this kind of clearing and she would see up ahead this little stream. And off to the left side of this stream is what looked like this kind of beaten up little footpath, but actually what it was an animal trail. So animals just kind of made their way around this area all the time, and so it kind of carved out a path. And so Bella would walk down to this animal path, and she would walk along the path that kind of went parallel with the stream, and she would walk for maybe 15 or 20 minutes until this animal path veered hard to the left, kind of went away from the stream. At that point, Bella would abandon the animal path and just continue walking along this stream, both stepping in the stream on some rocks and standing on either side when she could. And she would follow the stream due north, just going straight into the heart of this forest for about an hour, walking at a fairly leisurely pace until the stream connected with this east to west running river. And at this point, Bella would turn left, facing west, and she would follow along this riverbank about 20 minutes until the river fed into the man-made lake. And so she would stay at this lake, sitting on a rock, enjoy the view and look at the animals and listen to nature all around her. And then at some point she would turn around and retrace her steps all the way back to her car. For reference, one leg of this journey from car to lake or from lake to car took about 2 hours. Part of the reason Bella really enjoyed being in these woods and being at this lake was because it just kind of felt like they were hers. Because up until this summer in 2019, the only other people that Bella had ever seen anywhere in this forest or near this lake were other members of her family. So it really felt very private. So in June of that year, Bella comes home from college, and almost immediately she wants to go out to the man-made lake because she hasn't been in months. She's been in school, and so she's eager to get back to some place that she kind of considered to be her happy place. So one morning she gets up early, and by herself she leaves her house, she hops in her car, she drives the couple miles down the road, she pulls off onto that shoulder, she parks her car, she hops out, she turns away from the road, she walks into the forest, she finds the stream and starts walking along that animal path right to the side of the stream. She walks for a few minutes until she reaches the point where the trail kind of cuts to the left, and she just stays on the stream and is just continuing walking along the stream. And about 30 minutes later, when she was maybe 1 or 2 miles short of the east-west running river, she hears a bell somewhere off in the distance, way out in front of her, out towards the river. It sounds just like a chime, a single chime. And as soon as she hears it, she stops because there's never any people out here ever, and that bell sound came from somewhere in the forest. And so she stops because she's not really sure if she actually heard that, because it could have just been her mind playing tricks on her or something. And so she stops and just kind of listens for a second, and then she starts to hear this bell just continuously start ringing. Now, the ringing was not uniform. It was constant, but it was kind of sporadic, as if you were holding a bell and kind of ringing it randomly, like you might see at a sports game. And so she's thinking to herself, is there a dog that got lost somewhere up ahead and it's got a bell on its collar, and that's the sound I'm hearing. But as she's sitting there listening to this kind of sporadic bell sound, she's thinking, that's way too loud to be some rinky-dink bell on a pet's collar. So it's got to be something more robust. Did maybe somebody have a bell inside of a box, and that box got on the river and it's floated down river and it's like crashing into rocks or something? I mean, she's going through these very strange scenarios in her head, but she's not concerned about the bell. She's actually pretty intrigued. And since the sound of this bell seemed to be coming from the direction she was already traveling, she decided she would just keep on walking and hopefully see whatever it was that was causing this bell sound. And so Bella just began walking along the stream again, kind of listening to this bell and thinking about what it was going to be. And after about 5 minutes of her starting to walk again, the bell just stops. It goes totally silent. And when it does, it actually kind of startles Bella because she'd been listening to it so intently. And so she stops and she's listening, kind of expecting it to go off some more, but it doesn't. All she hears are the sounds of nature all around her. Now, Bella didn't have an explanation for what the spell was or why it stopped, but she really just wasn't that worried about it. She figured there was some sort of explanation for it. There had to be. And so she just kind of shrugged and kept on walking and put her focus back on getting to the lake. About 10 or 15 minutes later, Bella was still walking along the stream. She was still maybe a half mile or a mile short of the east to west running river when she sees up ahead on the left side of the stream as she's walking, there appears to be something laying on the ground that looks like it could be an animal or a rock. She doesn't really know what it is. And as she gets closer, she realizes it's a beaver laying on the ground, and this beaver is missing its head. Now, this is a huge forest, and Bella would have known that, of course, there are wild animals all over the place, and so finding the body of an animal that had been attacked by another animal was not unusual. That's nature. But what did strike Bella as odd was the cut on this beaver's neck was unbelievably neat and uniform, as if its head had been very carefully removed with a very sharp knife. And the beaver's head was nowhere to be found. It certainly did not have the appearance of having its head removed from some predator and its teeth. That would have been very rough. Also, the rest of the beaver's body was intact. So whatever killed this beaver was not interested in eating the beaver. As Bella stood over this beaver and was just staring at it, she also noted that there was no smell. Normally, when something dies, it begins to smell very quickly. It's part of the decomposition process. And so for there not to be a smell indicated to Bella that this beaver must have been killed fairly recently. And then when Bella kind of gently prodded the body with her foot, she realized the beaver's body was still fairly limp. So rigor mortis had not set in. Rigor mortis is another part of the decomposition process where the body kind of stiffens up, and that happens fairly soon after death. And so as Bella is realizing this beaver must have died very recently, it dawns on her that most likely whoever or whatever has killed this beaver is probably somewhere nearby. And Bella can't help but connect this dead beaver to that bell she was hearing earlier, which before meant nothing, but considering the bell was roughly coming from the same area where this beaver has now been found, it made her uneasy. And so Bella found herself whipping her head around, looking out into the trees, seeing if, there's some person, a hunter or somebody that would kind of explain what was going on, but there was nothing. And so Bella felt herself starting to panic a little bit, but then she stopped herself and said, "Calm down. It's broad daylight. I have been coming to these woods for years and years. I've never seen another person. I've never encountered some predatory animal. I'm sure everything is perfectly fine. I got nothing to worry about." And so she stepped over the beaver and kept on walking. Bella would eventually reach the east-west running river. She would turn left and walk for 20 minutes alongside this river. She'd reach the man-made lake. She enjoyed the beautiful view and the scenery, and then at some point she turned around and began retracing her footsteps. She walked past the beaver on the ground all the way back to her car, and she went home. A week later, Bella was sitting around her house when she felt pretty bored and decided kind of abruptly that in order to cure her boredom, she would go back to the place she loved so much, the man-made lake. And so she told her parents where she was going, and then she left the house, hopped in her car, drove to the pull-off and parked and entered the woods at 6 p.m. Sunset that night was at 9 p.m. and so Bella knew this would need to be a fairly quick turnaround so she didn't get trapped in the woods in the dark. And so Bella finds the animal trail. She follows along the stream until the trail goes left and she stays on the stream. She continues walking on the stream when she starts to hear the distant sound of thunder. And so she looks up into the sky through the trees and she can see the sky is starting to get dark, but she's still a couple of hours away from sunset. And so between the thunder and the dark skies, she knows a storm is rolling in. but she is determined to get to that lake. And so instead of, turning around and saying, okay, I'll come back another time, she just starts jogging along the stream to get there as fast as she possibly can. And almost immediately as she's jogging, the raindrops start to fall. And by the time she passes the beaver corpse on the ground, it hadn't moved, the rain was really coming down. And then about 15 minutes after the corpse, when she hit the east-west running river, that's when the rain was at a full downpour. Still, Bella turned at the river and continued west towards the man-made lake as if she was going to go all the way, but only about a minute or two into this final leg. She still had about 20 minutes to get to the lake. She stops herself and she looks at her watch and she can see it's after 8 o'clock already. And she's thinking to herself, if I turn around right now, it's going to take me over an hour to get back to my car. Sun sets at 9 p.m. It's after 8 p.m. now. So already I know I'm going to have to navigate this forest at night in the dark, even if it's just for a little bit at the end. And if I go all the way to the lake and then come all the way back to the car, I'm going to be in the forest after dark for quite a while, maybe up to an hour. And she's thinking, I'm confident I can do that, but it's also pouring rain. I'm cold. If I get lost, this could turn into a very bad situation. And so she ultimately decides that even though she really wants to keep going, she needs to turn around. She needs to head back. And so she turns around and she walks back up alongside this east-west running river to where the stream fed into that river. She turns and begins walking south along this stream, headed back towards the car. On her walk, because the visibility was starting to get quite bad because it was so dark, she had her head down at the ground because she didn't want to trip. She's stepping on rocks, she's stepping on muddy areas. She wants to make sure her footing is solid. And so her head is down, the rain is pounding all around her, and she's walking for about 15 minutes when all of a sudden something hits her in the top of the head. And so reflexively, she looks up and kind of puts her hands in front of her face to protect herself, and she sees what she had just run into. It was the beaver corpse. It was hanging from a string that was dangling off a branch right above her. And this beaver's head had been retrieved, and the head had been stitched onto the front paws of this beaver. And so she's looking at this beaver that's dangling from this rope. It's carrying its own head, and she's walked square into it. And her first reaction was basically to gag. She was going to vomit. She was so disgusted. And then she began frantically rubbing at her hair where this thing had made contact with her, because there could be juices from the decomposition that got on her. And then after frantically kind of patting at her head for a second, she stops and something really terrifying dawns on her. Whoever strung this beaver up to this tree and then stitched its head onto its paws, they had done that in the last 30 minutes, because 30 minutes earlier, when she was on her way in, she remembered passing the beaver carcass on the ground. She saw it. It had not moved from where it was the week before when she first saw it. And now this beaver is strung up in the tree. And so as the wheels are turning in Bella's head, she realizes that if someone has just done this, then they are probably nearby. And at this point, it's really starting to get dark. The rain is pounding all around her, and she starts whipping her head around, looking in all directions to see if there's someone out there that did this. But as she's looking, all she sees is just dark forest in all directions. And she knows she's at least 1 hour, even if she runs from her car. And so suddenly she is totally panicked. And in an effort to calm herself down, she says to herself, okay, I need to get out of here, but I have to walk. If I start running right now, this is going to turn into a complete nightmare. I just have to try to walk. And so she walks around this dangling beaver corpse and starts walking along the stream. And as soon as she's past that corpse, she feels the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She can hear movement behind her. She doesn't know what it is. It could be a deer, it could be some animal, but she's too afraid to turn around. And even though she was trying to tell herself to calm down, just keep walking, you're safe, you're freaking yourself out, everything is okay, as she's walking, she could feel herself starting to speed up until finally she was just running down this stream, sprinting actually away from this beaver and whatever it was that was moving around in that area. And at some point, she got so winded from sprinting so fast that she came to a stop, maybe 5 or 6 minutes after seeing this beaver. And as soon as she comes to a stop and she's walking, she still hasn't turned around yet, she hears the sound of that bell. And right away, it's the exact same sound she had heard the week before. It's that kind of constant, sporadic sound of someone ringing a bell. But in her panicked state, she doesn't know where it's coming from. She's so scared. Her anxiety is so high. She doesn't know if it's behind her or if it's off to the side. It's now completely dark out. And so she is full-blown terrified. There is someone or something behind her that has strung this beaver up that's probably watching her, and she can't see them. Even though she's beyond winded, she can barely breathe. She just starts sprinting sprinting as fast as she can. And as she's stumbling and falling on the rocks and tripping because she's not really looking where she's going, in the background and all around her, she's hearing this bell chiming and she's hearing something moving around in the woods behind her. And she pulls her phone out of her pocket, her iPhone, and as she's running, she dials her father. She puts the phone to her ear. She's crying. She's panting. She can barely breathe. Her father picks up and she's so relieved to hear his voice, but she can't even make a sentence. She just starts crying and wailing and pleading with him. Dad, come out to the forest. Meet me at the spot where the trail veers away from the stream. Meet me there. There's someone in the forest that's chasing me and I can't see them. Her father on the other end of the phone, he didn't know what to make of this, but he could hear the primal fear in his daughter's voice. And so he didn't ask any questions. He said, stay on the line. I'm coming to meet you right now. So Bella's father and mother, with Bella on the line, they run out of their house. They hop in their car. They speed the couple miles down the road. They park next to their daughter's car. And as they're running into the woods, they can hear way off in the woods the sound of the bell. They can hear the bell. They hear their daughter screaming on the phone. They can hear the bell coming through the phone, and she's begging them to please come into the woods, come in here, save me. And so the parents run into the woods and they begin running up the stream. Meanwhile, Bella, who's way out in the woods, she's still 10 or 15 minutes away from her parents. She is barely able to run at this point. She's exhausted almost all of her energy. And as she's getting closer and closer to her parents, the sporadic bell sound is getting louder and louder and louder, like whatever it is gaining on her. And she can hear behind her all these sticks and branches. They're breaking as if something is coming up to her. And finally, when it feels like this bell is right behind her head, she just kind of stops in defeat. She's too far away from her parents. She can't get to them in time. And so it was almost like she had to turn around and finally look at whatever it was that was behind her. And so terrified beyond words, Bella, who can barely breathe, she's so scared and so tired, she slowly turns around. Now, when she turns around and she's facing the other direction, she's looking across this clearing. She just happened to run past this clearing, and because it was a clearing, there was a little bit of moonlight that was coming down through the trees, just enough to illuminate this space that was about 50 feet wide. And as she's looking across this clearing, at first, she doesn't see anything. And then this tall, dark figure walks into the clearing, and as soon as it steps in, she can see it's got a bell at its waist. And with every step it took, it would violently ring the bell, causing the ringing sound. And so this thing starts moving into the clearing, and as Bella is staring at it, it was like time slowed down. She could not process what she was looking at. She didn't know what she was looking at. All she knew is whatever or whoever this is, they're coming straight at me. And so Bella suddenly got this unbelievable adrenaline rush. It was like her body went into autopilot to save her, and she turned around and began sprinting faster than she had ever sprinted in her life. And as she ran, all she could hear was the sound of that bell, which she now knew represented steps this thing was taking. And so the bell was getting faster and faster and louder, and she knew it was gaining on her. And she began lying and screaming out loud that, I'm on the phone with the police. They're right up ahead. They're going to be here any moment. But whatever it was that was behind her, they weren't fazed. They were just charging ahead, gaining on her second by second. Meanwhile, her parents had made it to the meeting spot, but her father, he felt like, I can't just sit here. And he just starts charging into the woods. He can hear his daughter screaming. He can hear this bell getting louder and louder. He just starts running towards it. And sure enough, seconds later, he sees his daughter come bounding out of the forest, and she leaps into his arms. He just grabs her, turns around, and runs with her back to the meeting spot. He grabs his wife, and the three of them just charge out of the forest, back to the parking lot, back in their car, and they speed off. In the car, all of them are crying. They don't know what to make of what just happened. Bella's trying to describe it, but she can't. And her parents, they had been on the phone listening to their daughter screaming, and all they kept saying to each other, the parents, was, I heard the bell. I heard the bell. I heard the bell. As if the bell confirmed their worst nightmares. That there really was someone or something out in those woods that was trying to do harm to their child. They would drive straight to the police station where Bella would file a report about what she experienced out in the forest. And then afterwards, her parents, as a precaution, took her to the hospital where she was determined to be okay, besides some bumps and bruises from falling down. The following morning, the police went out to the forest, to the area where Bella Bella had explained where she had been, and they searched all along that animal foot trail and all along the stream, but they never found any sign of this dark figure with the bell. Bella would tell police that she had a handbag, and as she was running back, she dropped the bag. She remembered where she dropped it along the stream, but when the police went to that area, the bag was gone. Also, the beaver was no longer there. It was not tied up to the tree. It was not on the ground. It was gone. The only thing police found that was out of the ordinary was they found a little ways off from the stream, basically along the path that Bella would have been running on, they found a t-shirt neatly folded placed underneath a rock. But the police and Bella and her family have no idea what that signifies. Ultimately, the police told Bella and her family that more than likely what she ran into was some kind of mentally unstable person that was living out in the woods, and perhaps when Bella came into the woods, they felt like she was on their property, and so they kind of tried to scare her off. But Bella has a hard time accepting that. She felt like, as she was running from whoever was behind her, that she was in mortal danger. That had it not been for her father running into the woods and literally grabbing her and running with her the rest of the way, that she may not have gotten out of the woods at all, that she might have been attacked and killed by whoever this was. She also can't help, when she looks back at the entire experience, thinking about that moment when she turned around and looked across that clearing and saw this figure come into the moonlight for the first time, that when it came into the moonlight, the way it was moving, the steps it was taking, they weren't normal, they were abnormal. There was just something off about this thing's movement, that it didn't seem like she was looking at a person, but rather some big animal. But regardless, since her ordeal, there have been no strange sightings out in those woods. However, almost no one ever goes in those woods except for Bella and her family, and Bella and her family, they don't go in those woods anymore. So whoever or whatever is out there is still just out there. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. And if you're the first person to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to sing at the like button's wedding, and then when it's time for them to have their first dance, sing a rendition of Du Hast by Rammstein in an Australian accent. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and hoodies and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our merchandise, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's johnballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is Mr. Ballen. We also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballen Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called Mr. Ballen, where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. In early 2014, a sheriff's department in a little town in Oregon conducted a search of a huge 20-acre farm tucked away inside of a forest. A local man had gone missing recently, and this farm was one of the few places they knew he had been. Very quickly into this search, a deputy was walking around the outside of the barn when he saw something strange on the ground. At first, he had no idea what it was, but as he got closer, it became very obvious. Not only would this discovery become front-page news all across the country, but it would also lead investigators to discover something much more sinister going on in that little town. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a cup of coffee, but be sure it's full of coffee grounds. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. By most people's standards, Susan Monica's life had been pretty good. She had a small but very close group of friends, she had a great job working as an engineer, and she lived in one of the most exciting cities in the world, San Francisco, California. But Susan was not happy. Moving to the big city was not so much a choice as it was a product of life and circumstance. Deep down, Susan had always been someone who preferred peace and quiet and being alone, things that were in rare supply in a big city like San Francisco. Many nights after work, Susan would come home to her apartment and she would sit there and dream about moving away from the city and living off the grid somewhere on a farm, raise her own food and be totally self-sufficient, away from everybody else in the world. And then one day in 1991, when Susan was 43 years old, she made that dream a reality. That year, she wound up purchasing a 20-acre farm located in a forest in a little town in Oregon called Weimar. However, this farm was really not a farm. There was nothing on it. There was no house for Susan to live in. There was no barn for her animals or tools. There was no running water, no electricity, no septic system. It was just pure Oregonian wilderness. But to Susan, it was perfect. The property kept her far away from other people, and she liked the idea of having to literally build her own farm. After all, she was an engineer by trade, so she actually knew how to build buildings efficiently and safely, and she was a big, strong, sturdy woman who was not afraid of manual labor. So when Susan finally arrived in Weimar and made her way up the winding dirt road through the forest and arrived in front of her property and looked out at the vast, rugged landscape for the first time, she was filled with a rush of excitement. Even though there was nothing on her 20 acres, it already felt like home. Over the next several months, Susan would transform these 20 acres into a neat little farm, complete with a big barn and a shack for her to live in, and a few animal pens for livestock. However, after the farm was built, Susan realized that building the farm was actually not the hard part. The hard part was maintaining the farm, going out there every day and doing all of her chores, feeding all the animals and doing all the different projects she had in mind. It was exhausting. And so not long after the farm was complete, Susan realized that as much as she wanted to be totally alone out there, she had to set that aside and hire some help. And so Susan printed out all of these help wanted flyers and put them all over town in Weimar, and before long, people began making their way up to her property to inquire about the role. Most of these applicants were people who struggled to find work elsewhere, either because they lived a sort of transient lifestyle, bouncing around from place to place so no one was ready to hire them long term, or because they had a criminal record and just straight up could not get a job. But Susan didn't care about either of those things. All she cared about was the people she hired would work hard and they would respect the peaceful, calm atmosphere she was fostering on her farm. Basically, do the work and leave me alone. And over the next 20 years, Susan would find dozens of people who were able to do just that. Most of them would work for Susan only for a short period of time. Others would stick around for a little bit longer, but eventually all of Susan's workers kind of rotated pretty quickly and moved on to other things. And when that happened, Susan would simply put up more help wanted flyers in town and hire more people. And in all the 20 years that Susan had been hiring these temporary workers at her farm, after they did move on and went somewhere else, Susan never heard about them again. However, that was about to change. On January 1st, 2014, Susan, who was 66 years old by this point, was outside of her shack out on her driveway when she happened to look up and see a car coming up her road. Now remember, she lives in the middle of nowhere. No one comes out to see her, so this is a very rare event. And so Susan is totally keyed in on this car. And this car, they pull into her driveway, and then out of the car popped 3 young people. It was 2 young men and 1 young woman. And before Susan could even ask them who they were or why they were here, they were telling her. They said they were looking for their father, Robert Haney, who at one point had told them he was working on Susan's farm in exchange for a little cash, and also Susan was letting him park his camper on her property, and he was living in that camper. The kids said their father always checked in with them at least once every couple of months, but they had just gone this really long stretch without hearing from him, and since he didn't have a cell phone and no permanent address, they had no real way of getting in touch with him, and so they were out there looking for him to make sure he was okay. And so they asked Susan, "Do you remember our dad, Robert? And if so, do you know where he is?" Even though this whole situation was totally surprising for Susan because she almost never got visitors, so that alone was kind of jarring for her. But when she heard the kids say their dad's name, Robert Haney, she immediately knew who that was. Susan told them that she had hired their father the previous spring to help build a structure on her farm. And initially, Robert was really nice to have around the farm. He worked really hard, he kept to himself, he was quiet, and he had a dog that was really friendly and loving. But in August of the previous year, so 5 months into Robert's employment on Susan's farm, Susan would tell them that their dad totally changed. He started drinking really heavily and not really working very much and spending a lot of the day just kind of ranting and raving outside of his camper about how he wanted to exact his revenge on someone. Susan would eventually find out that what Robert was talking about is apparently one of his kids had been assaulted, and he felt very guilty that he had not been there to protect his child. And so the way Robert was handling this guilt was by drinking and thinking about getting his revenge on the attacker. Now, while Susan did understand why Robert felt the way he did and why he was kind of acting the way he was, it didn't change the fact that Robert's behavior had become very disruptive on her farm, and the one thing Susan really wanted was peace and quiet. And so she decided she would have to go confront Robert about his behavior and potentially fire him if he couldn't find a way to calm down. But before Susan ever had to do that, Robert one day just walked right up to her shack. He handed her an envelope filled with cash, and he asked Susan if she wouldn't mind looking after his dog for a while. And Susan was so taken aback by his complete change in behavior and this request that she just took the envelope and said, "Okay, I'll look after your dog." And then Robert nodded as thank you. He turned around and he walked away from her. And then a few moments later, Susan's standing there with the envelope in hand, watching as Robert is climbing into some white car that had just pulled up in front of the property. She didn't know who was in the car with him, and then the car turned around and drove out of sight. Susan told the kids that that had happened back in September, so about 4 months ago, and since he left, she had not heard from him, despite the fact she still had his dog, and she told the kids that a lot of Robert's stuff was still in his camper. Susan brought the kids over to the side of her property where Robert's camper was, and when they went inside, sure enough, all their father's things were all over the place, but the one item that immediately stood out to them was their father's tool belt. They knew their father was a traveling handyman. That was how he made his living. And so it begged the question, why would he leave his tool belt here if he knew he was going to be gone for several months potentially? It didn't make any sense. After leaving Robert's camper, the kids thanked Susan and asked her to please be in touch if she learned anything else about their dad, and she said she would. And then the kids got back in their car and they began driving south towards the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. When they got there, they asked to file a missing person report for their dad. However, they learned very quickly that it was going to be very challenging to locate their dad because their dad lived this transient lifestyle with no cell phone, he had no permanent address, he had nothing that could really be traced. But the investigators agreed with Robert's children that their dad's absence was a big concern, given the fact that his last interactions with Susan had consisted of him drinking very heavily and talking about going and getting his revenge on his child's attacker. And so the sheriff and the deputies were very concerned that that was exactly what Robert had done. He had gone out and potentially murdered someone and now was in hiding. So they asked Robert's kids if they could think of absolutely anything that could possibly allow investigators to track down Robert. And at some point, one of the kids said, "Oh, what about my dad's EBT card?" EBT cards, or electronic benefit transfer cards, are like debit cards for state welfare services. You can use the cards to buy things like groceries, and the cards are definitely traceable. A few days later, when Robert's EBT card trace came back, investigators saw the card had been used just 1 month earlier in a Walmart located about 30 minutes southwest of Susan's farm. Now, this trace obviously didn't tell investigators where Robert was right now or what kind of condition Robert was in, but they had no other leads to operate on, so they decided they would go to the Walmart and see what they could find. When they got there, the investigators were led to the back room of the building where they were able to review the security footage from the previous month when Robert was supposedly there with his EBT card. But after reviewing hours and hours and hours of footage, the investigators never saw Robert on camera. However, they did see Susan on camera, and unbelievably, she was the one using Robert's EBT card. And so obviously this was very suspicious, and right away the investigators left the Walmart, went back to their office, and began the process of getting a search warrant to search Susan's farm. Last night, I decided I wanted to treat my family to a nice homemade dessert. And so I headed to the grocery store and I picked up a trough of spoiled milk and a hammock of fermented herring, and then I headed home to blend the two together to create a nice frappe milkshake. But right before I hit blend, I got a notification on my phone that said I had just spent $2,000 on swearatawalrus.com. Now, I love to swear at a walrus as much as the next guy, but that website became so addicting for me. I was swearing at 50 walrus a night, and so I had to cancel that months ago. And so I knew that $2,000 charge could not be mine. Someone had stolen my credit card. But when I pulled out my 20-pound wallet, my credit card was still there. Well, it turns out the Dementor that was at the grocery store with me, who bumped into me as I was scooping up my spoiled milk, he wasn't just bumping into me, he was using his RFID scanner and scanning my wallet through my jeans and ripping off my credit card information. Yes, that's a real thing. People literally can scan your cards with a scanner through your pocket. Needless to say, after I discovered this, I canceled my credit card and I got a Ridge wallet. Ridge Wallet has a sleek and durable design, they can hold up to 12 cards, and most importantly, they are built with RFID blocking technology. So if you're like me and you're tired of Dementors stealing your credit card information with RFID scanners, then you need to get a Ridge Wallet too. Get the best offer for Ridge with my link, ridge.com/mrballen, and save up to 40% through December 22nd. Again, that's ridge.com/mrballen. A few days later, on January 10th, the sheriff and his deputies arrived at Susan's property, and when they pulled onto her driveway, Susan came outside to greet them. When she asked them, what's going on, they told her, hey, we're here to search your property in connection with Robert Haney's disappearance. And before Susan could ask any more questions, the sheriff said to her, hold on, just turn around, let's go back inside, I need to talk to you privately. And so Susan, who was very shocked by this, just said, okay, and she turned around and led the sheriff into her house while the other deputies fanned out across the property to begin this big search. Once inside of Susan's house, they sat down in her kitchen, and right away the sheriff says to Susan, okay, I have you on camera using Robert's EBT card. I know you stole it, so you need to tell me where Robert is right now, or it's going to get a whole lot worse for you. And as soon as he said this, Susan's look of shock on her face quickly turned into a look of kind of relief. It was like suddenly she understood what was going on here. And she says to the sheriff, no, I didn't steal his EBT card. He gave it to me along with an envelope full of cash when he left 4 months ago, and he told me to use it to buy dog food for his dog that I'm looking after. And since Robert had been gone for all these months, she had run out of cash to pay for the dog food and now was using the EBT card. Susan also added that if she had just stolen the card from Robert, she wouldn't be able to use it because it requires a PIN number, and Robert gave her the PIN number. That's how she was able to use it. The sheriff was not totally sold on Susan's story, and so he continued to ask more questions, trying to trip Susan up about how she came to acquire this card, but Susan was very firm that Robert had given her the card, and that was it. And so after several minutes, the sheriff realized that Susan was likely telling the truth, which meant the EBT card angle was likely a dead end, and they would have to call off the search. But as the sheriff was standing up to leave the kitchen and leave the property altogether, a deputy from outside came running into the kitchen and without saying a word, just bent down and whispered something into the sheriff's ear. And as the sheriff is listening to this deputy, his face is contorting in disgust. He can't believe what he's being told. And after the deputy stands up and leaves the kitchen, the sheriff takes a deep breath and then looks at Susan and says, ma'am, you're going to have to come with us. Back at the station, a now very flustered Susan was led into a small interrogation room where she sat down looking totally anxious. She's looking around, wondering what's going on. And then the sheriff walked into the room, immediately hit record on the camera, and then looked at Susan and says, has anyone died on your property? The story that Susan would tell the sheriff that day in the interrogation room was so completely unexpected and horrific, it would make headlines all across the country. Before Susan began this story, she told the sheriff that everything she had said about Robert Haney's disappearance had been the truth. However, she had left one little detail out. After Robert had handed Susan that envelope full of cash and the EBT card, and then climbed into that stranger's car and driven away, after that, Robert had actually come back to her farm, and recently. Susan said she discovered his return when one morning she got up and she went outside to go feed her animals when she looked over at the pig pen and saw all the pigs who would normally be laying down and lounging around at that time of the day. They were all up and they had converged in one portion of the pig pen, and they had kind of formed a circle around something on the ground, as if they were all trying to look at something on the ground. Now, Susan said this was totally uncharacteristic, so obviously something weird was going on, and so Susan dropped her food and rushed over to the fence. She climbed into the pig pen, and as she got closer and closer to all these pigs, she realized they weren't just looking at something on the ground, they were eating something on the ground. And so Susan goes right up to this ring of pigs, and she begins pulling them aside, and then right in the middle on the ground is Robert. He was laying on his back, and his insides had all been torn out. It was like the pigs were disemboweling him, and the most shocking thing is Robert was still alive. He was moving his arm and groaning. Susan tried to pull the pigs off of Robert, but she said they kept coming back and really aggressively continued to eat Robert. It was like they were in this feeding frenzy. And so Susan said, I thought about lifting him up and moving him, but Robert was practically split in two, and she felt like if she tried to move him, that would kill him anyways. And so Susan said she did the thing that she thought was right at the time. She left the pig pen, went into the barn, got a shotgun, ran back to the pig pen, raised the weapon, and fired it into Robert. Susan told the sheriff that this was purely an act of mercy. She was ending his suffering. After Robert was dead, Susan said she just left the pig pen, and then 3 days later, she went back into the pig pen with bags and collected the little bits of Robert that had not been eaten by her pigs. And then she took those bags of remains and chucked them into her barn on top of the trash pile. But clearly, Robert's remains had not remained in the barn, because the thing that deputy had whispered into the sheriff's ear when the sheriff was talking to Susan in the kitchen was, "Sir, we found a leg outside." It was Robert's leg, and it was found not inside of the barn in the trash pile, but out in the middle of her property, just out in the open. Susan, when confronted with that information, suggested that, maybe a wild animal had gone into the barn, got a hold of it, and dragged it off. The sheriff didn't even know what follow-up questions to ask, and so he just said, "Well, why didn't you call 911 when you first saw Robert? I mean, maybe we could have saved him. Or at least after he was dead, why didn't you tell someone?" Susan would say that the reason she didn't tell anyone is she was afraid that if word got out about what her pigs had done, then her pigs would be euthanized and she would lose a major revenue stream because she sold her pigs' meat in town. And she said even if her pigs were not euthanized, she was worried people in town would not want to buy her pigs' meat after they learned her pigs were attacking and eating humans. Susan would tell the sheriff exactly where they could find the bags that contained Robert's remains, and she even said she would take a polygraph test to show she was now telling the whole truth. But when she actually sat down to take the polygraph test, she kept fidgeting and coughing and doing these really dramatic sighs, and it was causing the test operator to get really inaccurate readings. And so when this first polygraph test was over, the results were inconclusive. And so the investigators made Susan take another test, but again, she continued to fidget and yawn. And so finally, the investigators in the room watching this happen just called off the test. And when they did, they said to Susan, hey, we're going to search your farm, and if there is anything on your farm that you have not told us about, you're going to be in serious trouble because we're going to find it. At this point, Susan kind of stopped fidgeting and she looked up at the investigators, and after a long pause, she reached out across the table and grabbed a piece of paper and a pen. She pulled it back and she began drawing something. And after a few seconds, it became pretty clear she was drawing a map of her farm. And after the map was all drawn out, she drew a big X in the middle of it and then slid the map back across the table to the investigators. And she said, if you go to that X, you'll find Stephen. And the investigators are like, who's Stephen? We're talking about Robert. What are you talking about? Well, it would turn out Robert was not the only farmhand to die on Susan's property. In 2012, about a year before Susan hired Robert, she hired another man named Stephen Delacino. And according to Susan, Stephen was a lot like Robert. He was really easy to get along with, he was quiet, he worked hard. But at some point, Susan said they had a big falling out. Susan said she started to suspect that Stephen was stealing her guns in her barn, and so she went to confront him. And during this confrontation, they got into this big fight, and Susan said she didn't really remember all the details of what happened next, but at some point during this fight, a gun went off, and then Stephen fell to the ground in the middle of the pig pen with his head bleeding, and all of Susan's pigs suddenly swarmed him and began eating him. The stunned investigators again asked Susan, okay, if that really happened the way you said it did, why didn't you call 911 if this was like an accident? And Susan would say, again, that her big fear was her pigs would either be euthanized or word would get out that her pigs were eating people, and the people in town would not want to buy her pig's meat because of that. In the end, as far-fetched as Susan's stories were about what happened to Robert Haney and Stephen Delacino, there was never any evidence that actually contradicted her claims. And so as a result, when Susan went on trial for murdering Robert and Stephen, it came down to whether or not the jury believed Susan. And they didn't. Not at all. They believed that Susan was completely lying, and that in reality, Susan, who was known to have a very quick temper, shot Stephen and shot Robert very much on purpose, and then threw them into her pig pen. We can only hope they were dead before her pigs began eating them. On April 21st, 2015, more than a year after Robert's children had reported him missing, Susan was convicted of 2 counts of murder for Robert and for Stephen, and 2 counts of abusing a corpse. She was sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison. While in custody, Susan would be overheard saying there were 17 other bodies buried on her property. However, when the police went out there and searched again very extensively, they never found any other remains. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to make the like button a cup of coffee, but be sure it's full of coffee grounds. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we put out the remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. The podcast is called the Mr. Ballen Podcast, and it's available only on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity called the Mr. Ballen Foundation that provides support for victims of violent crime and the victims' families. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, Mr. Ballen Shorts and Mr. Ballen en Espanol. We put out near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. Those pages are just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our merch at shopmrballen.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.